The term human trafficking refers to the recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring, or receipt of people through force, fraud, or deception with the aim of exploiting them for profit. Even though everyone can become a victim of this crime, the trafficking experience is statistically more problematic for vulnerable individuals, since they are more likely to be manipulated and coerced. Although boys and men are victims as well, it is women and girls who are amongst the most targeted individuals. Indeed, the UN Office on Drugs and Crime 2018 report on human trafficking estimated that globally 65% of the victims are women and girls, since they are often trafficked for sexual exploitation, which is by far the main purpose of human trafficking, both globally and in Europe. In addition, women and girls are more at risk of being trafficked for the purpose of sexual and economic exploitation, especially prostitution and pornography, forced labor, arranged marriages, and to perform domestic functions. For these reasons, women and girls' experience of trafficking is significantly different to that of men, as they tend to suffer a disproportionately heavy impact and are more likely to be exposed to physical and psychological abuse and violence. Despite being human trafficking and women's trafficking in particular a widespread phenomenon around the world, according to the 2018 Global Slavery Index, 23% of global human trafficking takes place in Africa. Here, over half of human trafficking victims are in a forced marriage, and over 400,000 are victims of sexual exploitation, with women and girls accounting for over 99% of these victims. Given the statistical relevance of human trafficking in the African continent, our presentation will focus on three different forms of women's trafficking that are widespread in this region. We will first analyze the phenomenon of baby factories in Nigeria, then we will talk about the practice of forced marriage with a specific focus on Chad. Lastly, we will conclude with domestic servitude in Tanzania, and we will draw some final considerations on women's trafficking in Africa as a whole.
Child harvesting refers to the systematic sale of children, typically for adoption by families in the developed world, but sometimes for other purposes, including trafficking. Child harvesting programs, or the locations at which they take place, are sometimes referred to as baby factories. This term is used by journalists to describe criminal activities in Nigeria involving restriction of a person's movement against such a person's will, forced impregnation, sale of babies, and illegal adoption. In other words, a baby factory is any accommodation where mostly underage pregnant girls are kept with or without their consent, or young girls are encouraged or forced to become pregnant for the purpose of giving birth to babies that are sold to diverse clients. Nigeria has become over the years a notorious hub for all forms of human trafficking. A regional project launched in 2003 by the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime found in a case study that it appeared that the human trafficking activities that take place in Nigeria are carried out entirely by Nigerian citizens. Human trafficking is ranked the third most common crime in Nigeria after financial fraud and drug trafficking. A common motive for human trafficking is to subject those trafficked to sexual slavery within and outside the country. Moreover, although Nigeria has established laws against human trafficking, they do not, however, address emerging trends like the farming, sale, or trafficking of babies. Nigerian security agents have uncovered a series of alleged baby factories in recent years, notably in the southeastern part of the country. Child harvesting in Nigeria is a subset of human trafficking. It often takes place in structures disguised as maternity homes, orphanages, clinics, and small-scale factories where women and girls are held captive to deliver babies in return for monetary compensation. A black market for newly born babies has developed in parts of the country to provide infants to wealthy families who prefer cheaper clandestine methods as a substitute for surrogacy, in vitro fertilization, assisted reproductive technology, or adoption through social services. Moreover, some children are then forced into child labor, trafficked into prostitution, or, as several reports suggest, ritually killed. At least 10 children are reportedly sold every day across the country. There is no official data to show exactly how many babies are bought and sold each year in Nigeria, nor the number of girls exploited by human traffickers. The United Nations estimates, however, that about 750,000 to 1 million persons are trafficked annually in Nigeria. and that over 75% of those trafficked are trafficked across the states, 23% are trafficked within states, while 2% are trafficked outside the country. The discovery of baby factories in Nigeria has been on the rise since it was first mentioned in a United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization report in 2006. Here are some of the baby factories discovered over time in Nigeria. In 2008, a network of baby factories claiming to be orphanages was revealed by police raids. In 2011, Nigerian police raided 2 more hospitals, thereby dismantling 2 baby factories. In June, 32 pregnant women were found in a hospital of the Red Cross Foundation, and in October, 17 pregnant women were found in another hospital. In 2014, there were at least 8 discoveries of baby factories in Nigeria, an increase of 60% over the preceding year, with no fewer than 71 pregnant or recently delivered women found in them. Last year, police busted a child trafficking syndicate in southwest Nigeria, where women were kidnapped, impregnated, and their babies sold. 4 children and 4 pregnant women were among those freed. As already mentioned, the phenomenon of baby factories, as well as baby trafficking, is growing into one of the most lucrative forms of organized crime in Nigeria, consisting of powerful suppliers and clients. Several dimensions are noticeable in the practice of baby trafficking. In particular, 3 principal dimensions can be noted. The first is the highly sophisticated and organized farming of babies. The second dimension relates to the activity of some maternity homes and private hospitals, and the third dimension of the business relates to sham adoptions. As said, the first dimension is the highly sophisticated and organized farming of babies. These operations are usually carried out by registered organizations that are disguised as hospitals, maternity homes, rehabilitation centers, and orphanages. Most operators are, however, unregistered. A typical organized syndicate in baby factories and trafficking may involve diverse actors, with each performing specialized roles in the maintenance of the business. The baby factories are mostly managed by quacks, fake doctors who claim to have medical qualifications, or nurses who have abandoned formal practice to provide antenatal care for the pregnant girls due to its profitability. Some of the baby factory operators are known to keep teenage girls and allow their sons or male syndicate employees to impregnate them. Once a girl is pregnant, she is separated from those yet to be impregnated. After delivery, the girls are offered a meager amount of money and their babies are taken from them and sold to clients for an agreed amount. The second dimension relates to the activities of some maternity homes and private hospitals that do not engage in deliberate baby farming, but through their network of laboratory technicians, nurses, doctors, and facilitators spread across the country, encourage girls with unwanted pregnancies to deliver babies in their facilities. In most cases, they provide teenage and single mothers who do not want to keep their babies with shelter and care while they are pregnant, and then sell their babies for a premium to couples that want them. They are made to sign papers renouncing their rights to the babies, as well as swearing oath of secrecy not to disclose what has transpired. The third dimension of the business relates to sham adoptions. The operation involves layers of fraudulent activities. It usually starts with a pregnant teenager delivering a baby at a hospital. Afterwards, the baby is deposited in an orphanage. Some clients, which are people seeking to adopt a baby, plan with assessors without following the due process stipulated for child adoption. These assessors, who are supposed to be attached to magistrate courts, procure fake or forged court orders with which they sell the babies, in most cases to childless couples. We will show a brief interview with a girl who had to face the hardships and inhumane treatments within a baby factory in 2019.
These are some of the women and girls who were rescued from a baby factory in Lagos. Brought from all over Nigeria with promises of work, they were instead abducted and impregnated by captors planning to sell their babies.
We rescued 19 pregnant girls, mostly from ages 15. The highest, the oldest person there is 28, but majority of them are teenagers.
Woman checked me, now put medicine in my private parts. Surgery, neighbor started to do me. The baby is 7 months. I was in the labor complete 3 days. I did not deliver. Police people come and arrest us that we are the people that born and selling children.
Police said baby boys were sold for around $1,630 and girls for $980. The State Criminal Investigation Department will now take over the case.
Forced marriage is a marriage in which one or more of the parties is married without their consent or against their will. A marriage can also become a forced marriage even if both parties enter with full consent if one or both are later forced to stay in the marriage against their will. A forced marriage differs from an arranged marriage in which both parties presumably consent to the assistance of their parents or a third party such as matchmaker in finding and choosing a spouse. There is often a continuum of coercion used to compel a marriage, ranging from outright physical violence to subtle psychological pressure. Though now widely condemned by international opinion, forced marriages still take place in various cultures across the world, particularly in parts of South Asia and Africa. The prevalence of forced marriage among all world regions is by far the highest in Africa at an estimated 4.8 victims for every 1,000 people. Sub-Saharan Africa is particularly affected by child marriage, with 38% of women married before the age of 18 and 12% married before the age of 15. It is further estimated that if current progress persists, Sub-Saharan Africa will have the largest number and global share of child brides by 2050. In Africa, child and forced marriage are often promoted by long-standing religious and socio-cultural traditions. For example, many communities see these practices as a way to reinforce and strengthen tribal or familial connections, to guarantee a girl's future and safety, or to prevent dishonor for the girl and her family in the event that she was raped or sexually abused outside of wedlock. In South Africa, there is a practice called Ukutvala, by which young girls and women are kidnapped by men and coerced into marriage, often involving sexual violence or rape. An Ethiopian tradition called Telefa involves the kidnap and rape of the girls. The girl's subsequent pregnancy is then used to justify the marriage. Although made illegal in 1996, Telefa is allegedly still practiced in rural parts of northern eastern Ethiopia. In Niger, which has the highest rate of child marriage in the region with 76% of women being married before the age of 18, it is often a desperate economic decision for parents to sell off their daughters to wealthier men to boost their family's income. On the other hand, in Chad, forced marriage is driven by different reasons, like gender inequality and the belief that girls are somehow inferior to boys. There are different types of forced marriage. First, marriage by abduction, also known as bride kidnapping. It is a practice in which a man abducts the woman he wishes to marry. Marriage by abduction has been practiced throughout history around the world and continues to occur in some countries today, particularly in Central Asia, the Caucasus, and parts of Africa. A girl or a woman is kidnapped by the groom-to-be, who is often helped by his friends. The victim is often raped by the groom-to-be for her to lose her virginity, so that the man is able to negotiate a bride price with the village elders to legitimize the marriage. The future bride then has no choice in most circumstances but to accept. If the bride goes back to her family, she and her family will often be ostracized by the community because the community thinks she has lost her virginity and she is now impure. Then we have the forced marriage by parents, families, and communities. It occurs when parents or other family members force one or both of the participants into the marriage. This type of forced marriage is usually supported by the surrounding community, making it difficult to avoid or escape. We also list as forced marriage the one conducted by religious leaders, the one conducted in conflict zones, the trafficking for the purpose of forced marriage, the adoption for the same purpose, forced marriage through hereditary slavery, the one conducted by a partner, and the one conducted by a judge. We will now take into consideration a case study, the country of Chad. In Chad, 67% of girls are married before the age of 18 and 30% are married before the age of 15. Child marriage occurs when one or both spouses are below the age of 18. While boys can be affected, the practice predominantly impacts girls. It is often referred to as early enforced marriage because the girls, given their young age, can rarely make a free and informed decision about their marriage partner, the timing or the implication of this binding commitment. An element of coercion may be involved because their families may pressure or force the girls into marriage. Strong social and cultural norms also drive the practice despite the legislation in place. The legal age at marriage, either with or without parental consent or approval by pertinent authority, is 15 years old for females. Chad has one of the highest child marriage prevalence rates in the world. On average, almost 3 out of 4 girls will be married before their 18th birthday. The national average of 20-24-year-old female married by the age of 18 is 72%. The question is, what drives child marriage in this country? Chad faces complex and interlinked humanitarian crises: food insecurity, forced displacement, severe droughts, and epidemics. At the end of 2019, there were 5.3 million people in need of humanitarian assistance and 740,000 displaced people, including more than 440,000 refugees from Central African Republic, Sudan, and Nigeria, all of which has strained the local resources. Humanitarian situations like in Chad exacerbate poverty, insecurity, and lack of access to services such as education, factors which all drive child marriage. While gender inequality is a root cause of child marriage in both stable and crisis contexts, in time of crisis, families see child marriage as a way to cope with greater economic hardship and to protect girls from increased violence. In Chad, child marriage is exacerbated by a lot of reasons. First of all, displacement. Girls are at heightened risk of sexual violence within the displaced communities. Cultural norms often force girls to marry their attackers to preserve their honor. Then we have the level of education. Chadian girls with no education marry at the age of 16 years old on average, compared to 19 years old for girls who have completed secondary education. Another reason is poverty. Poor families marry off their daughters early to reduce their perceived economic burden and to obtain the dowry. Another reason is religion. Child marriage occurs among Catholic, Protestant, animist, and Muslim households and is often associated with the misguided notion of protecting a girl's honor and shielding her from sexual attention. Another reason is female genital mutilation and cutting. 38% of women aged 15-49 have experienced FGM in Chad. The practice is used as a way of controlling female sexuality and is sometimes regarded as a sign of readiness for marriage. The last cause is polygamy. Some girls are married off as third or fourth wives to men, as they are often seen as easier to control. This is particularly common among the Fule community. Chad has committed to eliminate child, early and forced marriage by 2030, in line with the target 5.3 of the Sustainable Development Goals. In February 2019, the government, with support from the UN and the Organization of African First Ladies Against HIV, adopted a new costed roadmap to ending child marriage and female genital mutilation, with 6 pillars: consolidation of the legal, institutional and policy framework, development of a communications and mobilization campaign, improvement of access to services and attention to victims and survivors, the capacity building of social agents, improvement of infrastructure, improvement of coordination, monitoring and evaluation. A thematic working group created by the Ministry of Women, Social Action and National Solidarity is responsible for implementing the action plan. This testimony is from Genevieve. She is 12 years old. 3 years ago, she was forced into an early marriage. Her older sister was married to a friend of their father's, an old man who neared his 70th birthday. She was only 15. One day, she took off because she could no longer take that marriage. She ran far away from the family and the village and married a young man of her own choosing. When a bride leaves, however, it is tradition for the family to return her dowry. Her dad owed them 7 cows. He could not afford such a sum, at least not right away. When the old man passed away, her dad visited his children to ask for their patience. He promised them that he would pay off his debts once his 9-year-old girl married. That 9-year-old girl was Genevieve. The old man's family refused to wait. Instead, they demanded she married a boy of 14 years old. Her dad was indebted to them, so he said yes, and she became a bride. She was rescued by World Vision. They heard about her story, and they were determined to bring her back to her parents, send her to school. They spent 5 months talking, negotiating with the family, until she finally returned home.
The term domestic servitude refers to a form of forced labor, which can also amount to slavery because of the unique context and challenges it presents. Domestic labor is commonly used as a cover for the exploitation and control of someone, predominantly women or young girls, and it is considered to be a form of human trafficking exactly because the initial employment agreement of domestic help transitions into a situation whereby victims cannot live on their own free will. At present, domestic work is a highly feminized sector, and because women have integrated the global labor market, households increasingly rely on domestic workers to fill that gap. Domestic workers have also gradually taken up roles traditionally reserved to extended family members or public care service providers. However, domestic work is a labor sector which is particularly vulnerable to exploitation and trafficking. According to the International Labour Organization, of the estimated 67 million men and women who work as domestic workers across the globe, around 80% are women and girls, with more girls under the age of 16 working in domestic service than in any other category of child labour. In addition, approximately 11 million of these women are migrants, who, driven by poverty, find themselves forced to accept working and living conditions that violate their fundamental human rights. In those circumstances, many female domestic workers are exposed to abuse, such as physical and social isolation, restriction of movement, psychological, physical and sexual violence, intimidation and threats, retention of identity documents by their employer, withholding of wages, abusive working and living conditions, and excessive overtime. Other than that, there are 3 additional reasons why domestic work is considered as a form of labor, which is particularly vulnerable and subject to exploitation, especially of women and young girls. The first aspect is the lack of recognition of the professional status. Domestic workers are not recognized as real workers, and the level of rights and protection is usually lower than general labor standards. They are generally underpaid, their work is undervalued, their social security coverage is poor, and they often have to work long hours. The second aspect is the lack of regulation and violation of rights. The lack or shortage of regulations on domestic work leads to limitations of the workers' rights and of their chances of obtaining fair compensation if they are abused, or even if their working and living conditions are terrible or inhuman. The third aspect is the lack of law enforcement and controls. One of the main obstacles to state action is the private aspect of the workplace. Indeed, protection rules and mechanisms of state regulation, such as labor inspection, cannot be put into action, since labor inspectors have very limited power to prevent, identify, and protect victims when faced with the principle of inviolability of the private households. In Africa, Tanzania is the country where domestic servitude as a form of modern-day slavery is one of the top human trafficking issues. According to a survey conducted by the International Labour Organization jointly with the Tanzanian government, the vast majority of the 4.2 million children in the country who are involved in child labour are girls, who were tricked and then trafficked into domestic servitude. One of the main causes of domestic servitude in Africa and in Tanzania in particular is poverty. Hardship in rural areas forces children to migrate to cities to find jobs in private households. Some parents choose to send their daughters away to work as an alternative to early marriage, unaware of the abuse and exploitation that frequently awaits them. Indeed, many Tanzanian girls from rural areas are trafficked to urban centers and the island of Zanzibar for domestic servitude and commercial sexual exploitation. We have collected in this presentation two testimonies, one of them being from Rose, a 13-year-old girl raised in mainland Tanzania who was targeted by recruiters who used the glamour and wealth of Zanzibar to convince parents to send their children into domestic work. The girl left home thinking of finding in Zanzibar good economic and educational opportunities. However, what awaited her was a life of fear and exploitation, a fate that has become alarmingly familiar to many other young women as well. Recalling her experience, Rose explains, Zanzibar is a place for tourists. There are hotels, attractions, and money, so parents think if their daughters go here, they can expect something good. During the months Rose spent living as a child domestic worker for a wealthy family, she recalls of being forced to work from sunrise to sunset, never paid a beaten for the smallest infraction. She recalls, I was washing the dishes, but it got too dark to finish, so I went to sleep. Then in the morning I was woken up very early and beaten. They locked me in the toilet from 5 a.m. until 4 p.m. and then my employer threw me out of the house. A recent national child labor survey shows that nearly 111,000 Tanzanian girls are domestic servants who often find themselves in particularly vulnerable situations of violence and abuse, crimes that usually remain unpunished due to lack of resources and impossibility to turn on to someone to ask for accountability. In addition, although no reliable statistics are available, some estimates suggest that around 3% of the population in urban areas are living children working in private homes. Up to a third of children in domestic work are below 14 and can be as young as 10, and over 80% of them are girls. They are often forced to work long hours without getting the salaries they are initially promised and have a little chance of attending school and getting an education, therefore limiting their chances to find good jobs in the future. In addition, being far from their families makes working children, and especially women, more vulnerable to exploitation, which in many cases amounts to physical and sexual abuse perpetrated in private households. A survey carried out by the British NGO Anti-Slavery International in 2012 found that less than 0.5% of the children in domestic work had formal contracts. Over 40% suffered physical abuse and other cruel and degrading treatment from their employers, 17% suffered sexual abuse, and over 60% did not attend school and were illiterate and innumerate. Other common problems included little or no pay, despite working up to 60 plus hours a week, and working in complete isolation, which limits children's movements, any social life, and contact with families. Another testimony comes from a 14-year-old Rachel, who was beaten and forced to work for 16 hours a day with no pay for a family in Zanzibar City. She cooked, cleaned, washed clothes, and helped take care of children. She was also repeatedly raped and assaulted by her employer. Recalling her experience, she says, My boss said, "Don't you love me? Come sit on my lap," and forced me to kiss him on the mouth. Then he took me to a room where there was a mattress on the floor. He saw no one was around and locked the door. He lay me down and said, "Don't be scared. I'm not your father." Fortunately, both Rachel and Rose are now being taken care of at a trafficking shelter, but their stories continue to represent one of the biggest human rights challenges in Tanzania. Indeed, even when victims manage to escape or be rescued, they are often not believed by their families and close friends. Moreover, they often feel ashamed of their conditions as domestic servants because of the abuses they suffered. This makes it even harder for them to act as a warning for others. Currently, there's only one available shelter, the Action Aid Shelter in Zanzibar, for those victims trying to escape abuse. A woman coordinator at the shelter for child domestic workers in Zanzibar says, There is no school, no salary, no playmates. They are treated like slaves. Notwithstanding this, in the 2017 Trafficking in Persons report, the US State Department said that Tanzania is making significant efforts despite not fully meeting the minimum standards for the elimination of trafficking.
There is abundant research demonstrating that human trafficking has severe physical, mental, intellectual, and emotional impacts on women and girls, altering their lives forever. They often face life-threatening health risks, such as being more susceptible to sexually transmitted diseases due to forced sexual intercourse and complications during childbirth in young girls. In addition, women and girls who are trafficked are taken away from their educational opportunities. They either have to drop out of school to tend to home duties and raise children once they are married, or were never sent to school in the first place, as many parents believe an investment in their daughter's education will be wasted if she is simply going to be a mother and wife. Beyond the personal impact on the victims, the subjugation of women and girls through forced and child marriage practices perpetuates gender inequality and consequently impedes development of communities, nations, and the region as a whole. Indeed, Africa has had very limited success in achieving 6 of the 8 Millennium Development Goals, including poverty, education, gender equality, child mortality, maternal health, and HIV, all of which are issues related to forced marriage, domestic servitude, and the practice of baby factories. Lastly, the findings of our research revealed that women continue to be vulnerable despite the current efforts of the government to curb human trafficking. The findings of the study indicated that the participants were not aware of their human rights, which also confirmed a general lack of knowledge about services that would be due to them, resulting in re-traumatization, the delay of the healing progress, or no progress at all.
It can be noted that all 3 cases have similar causes and consequences. Thus, we will provide an outline of some measures that could be taken in order to reduce the phenomenon in Africa and protect women's rights. In particular, we centered our research on 3 main strategies to curb trafficking and its diverse forms. The first approach is to ramp up poverty reduction strategies. Some poor families marry off their daughters, often at a too young age, because they might gain a bride price or simply because they have one less mouth to feed. Moreover, child domestic work in Tanzania is driven principally by extreme poverty of so many families. Many girls run away from home to avoid domestic abuse or forced marriage, only to then end up as domestic workers. Finally, many girls are forced to sell their babies in order to survive one more day, as they cannot afford taking care of another person. This is why strategies have to focus primarily on reducing the economic inequality and the poverty of the African population in order to prevent girls and women from being trafficked. In particular, some strategies include a rapid and broad-based economic growth that is accompanied by a reduction of income disparity, increased investment in human capital development, and a creation of special economic opportunities for women. The second strategy is to empower girls with information, skills, and support networks, in particular to enhance girls' access to high-quality education. The world's learning crisis is hitting Africa the hardest, particularly its girls. According to UNESCO's Institute for Statistics, there are 32 million out-of-school children of primary age in Africa, and 28 million out-of-school adolescents, the highest rate globally. Exclusion and the absence of foundational education skills are rooted in the early years, and girls are disproportionately affected, with only 1 in 3 completing lower secondary education. Moreover, girls living in conflict situations are 2.5 times more likely to be out of school, becoming more exposed to abuse, exploitation, gender-based violence, and child marriage. This is why actions have to be taken to tackle inequality in education in order to reduce the possibility of trafficking for girls and women. Through education, girls can become more knowledgeable and self-confident. These gains enable girls to advocate for themselves, make better decisions, and aspire to alternatives to early marriage, domestic servitude, or selling their babies. In particular, educating girls to make sure they're aware of their rights and the impact child marriage or child harvesting will have on their futures, as it's vital that girls know about the legislation where it exists, and educating parents because of the traditional beliefs they might have about gender roles and may be unaware of breaking the law. The third strategy is to encourage supportive laws and policies. Weak law enforcement, owing to the complicity of state actors, has for a long time meant that apprehending traffickers is unlikely, prosecuting those arrested less so, and securing conviction even more difficult. Thus, effective monitoring of orphanages, hospitals, and maternity homes by responsible government agencies will contribute to checking the illicit activities carried out by these centers, which ensure the sustainability of baby farming and trafficking. This will also require the training of law enforcement officials in appropriate investigative techniques to better uncover the dynamics of this illicit business. There is equally the need to effectively define and criminalize this evolving menace, including imposing stiffer penalties. Furthermore, it is important for any country to have a minimum age of marriage, as this legally protects children from abuse, harm, violence, and exploitation. Laws to address child marriage should be part of a comprehensive legal and policy framework which addresses its root causes, including gender inequality. This is why laws, of which there is lack of awareness, have to be publicized, and all offenders have to be dealt with properly.
As we have seen during the presentation, human trafficking is a widespread issue with various facets. Normally, only its most universally known practices are addressed by the general public, such as sexual exploitation or forced labor, while more underlying issues are rarely mentioned. Our attempt was to introduce specific varieties of women trafficking which are not widely known, such as domestic servitude or child harvesting. Indeed, these forms of trafficking have severe consequences for the girls and women involved. Thus, it is of utmost importance to focus government's attentions and resources to implementing countermeasures to the issues, particularly combating poverty and education inequality, and by enhancing supportive laws for the protection and prevention of women's trafficking.